Welcome back, my dear crime lovers. This is part 3 of a series dedicated to Frank Costello that are part of the history of the American Mafia. The podcast brought to you by Fabio Fabiano and read and translated by me, Grace Carlisi. I do hope you enjoy this new episode. In 1931, after the deaths of Masseria and Maranzano, Lucky Luciano became the boss of what would become his own crime family. Vito Genovese became his deputy and Costello his advisor, an important function within the Mafia clan. Costello was a prominent figure in the criminal underworld, earning large sums of money by becoming the head of the gambling industry. In 1936, Lucky Luciano was arrested for exploiting, aiding and abetting prostitution and sentenced to serve a 30-year prison sentence. At first, he tried to run his Mafia family directly from prison, but later promoted his deputy Vito Genovese to the role of boss. In 1937, Genovese became a murder suspect and therefore was forced to return to Italy and take refuge in Naples. At that point, Luciano named Costello as the new boss of his crime family. With the help of his caporegime or caporegime, Joe Adonis, Anthony Carfano and Michael Coppola, Costello managed the family, successfully avoiding investigations, problems, and at the same time increasing profits. He controlled the American criminal underworld from the East Coast to the West Coast. In Louisiana, Carlos Marcello was employed to manage the slot machines. In Florida, it was his partner Meyer Lansky who controlled all gambling activities, whereas bettings on horse racing in Los Angeles was under the control of Bugsy Siegel. The bookmakers were run by another affiliate, Frank Erickson. In his heyday, Costello was a key figure in New York nightlife, believed to be the surreptitious owner of the Copacabana and other popular nightclubs. He managed gambling halls from Saratoga to New York to Miami. Costello was considered a VIP on a par with movie stars, writers or sports personalities like Joe DiMaggio or singers like Frank Sinatra. In 1937, Genovese, who had fled to Italy to escape American justice as he had been accused of murder, was permitted to return to the United States after the Second World War because all the witnesses accusing him of the murder were deceased, and therefore there would be no trial. Once back in the USA, Vito Genovese hoped to be restored as head of the Luciano family, but things had changed. He discovered that Costello was now the boss in charge, and that the underboss position belonged to Willie Moretti. He was left with the role of caporegime, which, as we will see later, will not be of his satisfaction. In December 1946, Luciano, despite having been evicted to Italy, organized the Havana Conference in Cuba. This Mafia summit lasted for several days. Among the guests present were Costello, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese and Meyer Lansky. During the meeting, the mafiosi decided the fate of Bugsy Siegel and the future of Genovese within the Luciano family. Siegel was not invited. Those present at the conference decided that he would be killed. Genovese, during the meeting in Havana, expressed his desire to once again become the head of the family, as in 1937. Following these claims, he started a fight with Luciano. Genovese ended up with 3 broken ribs, and to get back on Luciano, he informed the US government that Charles Lucky Luciano was in Cuba and had not left for Italy. Luciano was furious and was forced to leave the country. Soon after the conference, Genovese started his war against Costello in New York. Between May 1950 and 1951, several gangsters and politicians were heard by the US Senate Investigative Committee. The interrogations in those days were televised. Costello was questioned, even though his face was never framed and only his hands were filmed. He was considered the character with the greatest mediatic attention and number one of the American underworld. Thanks to his political influence, he passed the hearings without much damage. Some were sure that no one could become a judge in New York without Costello's consent. In that same year, Costello began his long battle with the US government. However, because of his refusal to answer some of their questions at the public hearings, he was investigated for contempt of court and sentenced to 18 months prison. He was later charged with a tax evasion fee and sentenced once again for another 5 years. In 1957, released on bail, he had to deal with another threat. This time, it came from his main rival for supremacy in the New York criminal cartel, Vito Genovese. On the night of May 2nd, 1957, in Manhattan, in the lobby of his hotel, shots were fired in Costello's direction in front of one of the elevators. The shooter was Genovese's driver and trusted man, namely Vincente the Chin Gigante, or Giant. The killer aimed for his head. Before the shot was fired, the Giant shouted out, "This is for you, Frank." That sentence caught Costello's attention and he turned just enough to avoid being mortally wounded. Gigante, convinced that Costello was dead, fled the scene. Costello at that point, realizing the danger he had escaped, was forced to take a step back, and Genovese became once again the boss. In exchange for his complacent decision, Costello was allowed to enter the gambling business in Florida and Louisiana. Although Costello was officially nothing more than a soldier at that point, everyone still saw him as a boss. Genovese decided to proclaim himself the new boss. He convened the commission and changed the name of the crime family. Vito Genovese became the boss of the Genovese crime family from there on. Albert Anastasia was furious over Costello's assassination attempt, therefore representing a threat. Vito Genovese decided to have him killed. He enlisted the help of Lucchese and Gambino, who was Anastasia's deputy at the time. On October 25th, 1957, Anastasia was murdered at the barber shop at the Park Sheraton Hotel. The killers were the Gallo brothers. After Anastasia's death, Gambino was promoted and became the boss of his own crime family, and Genovese became the most powerful gangster in New York. Later that year, Costello was convicted once again for contempt of the grand jury and served his many sentences for several years. He was released on June 20th, 1961, but he lost his US citizenship. His power in the crime syndicate was now in decline. 1969, even after the death of Vito Genovese, his role was limited to advisor and dispute arbitration. Gambino and Lucchese became the new strong figures of Cosa Nostra. Whenever the two bosses needed advice, they visited the penthouse of the Hotel Waldorf Astoria, where Costello lived. On February 18, 1973, at the age of 82, the boss died in a hospital in Manhattan as a result of a heart attack.